One aspect of Microsoft Azure cloud governance relates to the use of management groups to organize subscriptions and the use of resource groups to organize individual cloud resources. When we say cloud resources, we're talking about things like virtual machines or storage accounts, web apps, function apps, any type of object that you can create in the Azure cloud. Let's start with management groups. So with management groups, you can use these to organize multiple subscriptions in a hierarchy. In other words, if all you've got in Azure is a single subscription, there's no point in working with management groups. Remember, you need a subscription if you want to be able to deploy any type of resource. And remember also that the subscription really serves as a cost type of boundary. All your monthly cloud computing charges are tied to your subscription. So the use of a management group then is to organize multiple subscriptions in a hierarchy to do what? Well, to facilitate the application of Azure policy and role-based access control. Azure policy is a granular way to check for compliance for the configuration of cloud resources, maybe even to limit how cloud resources are deployed in a certain region, and we can apply that to a management group. Now, if you've organized multiple subscriptions under that management group, those Azure policy settings would apply to all of the subscriptions in the management group, and the same goes for RBAC, for role-based access control. If you were to make an RBAC role assignment to the management group, that would flow down to the subscriptions under it, and within each subscription, it would flow down the hierarchy to each resource group, and ultimately to each cloud resource that you've deployed. In the Azure environment, you always have a default management group called the tenant root group. So when you create one or more management groups, they are created under the tenant root group. Speaking of a hierarchy, you can actually nest management groups. So you could create a management group under your tenant root group called East, let's say, and under East, you create another management group perhaps for a region or a city or a department or anything along those lines, whatever it is that you want to use to organize your subscriptions. So only larger organizations will tend to have a multitude of subscriptions. Pictured on the screen, we've got a screenshot of the management group hierarchy in Azure. Now this is done in the Azure portal where you can search the search bar at the top center of the screen for management group. That would take you into the management group console like we've done here. On the left, the overview blade or page is selected, and on the right, I've expanded the hierarchy. You can collapse or expand each part of the hierarchy. So notice at the top, we have the tenant root group, under which I have another management group called East, under which I have a subordinate management group called MG1, and finally under that, I've got my pay-as-you-go subscription. Now, if you had multiple subscriptions under the MG1 management group, if you apply Azure policy or RBAC assignments to MG1, it would flow down to all the subscriptions that exist underneath it. And of course, you can select the menu icon at the far right of the subscription like I've done here, and then you'll get a move option. So you can move subscriptions throughout the hierarchy as required. In the next screenshot, we have an example of assigning Azure policy to a management group scope. Now, on the right, in the scope blade, we have a list of management groups up at the top. So we can select a management group that we want to apply Azure policy to, and ultimately we could choose a subscription if we really wanted to. Over on the left, the policy definition determines which policy will actually be applied, in this case, to whatever scope is selected. Next, we have resource groups. So in Azure, you can use a resource group to organize related cloud resources in a quote-unquote container, not to be confused with an Active Directory container or an application container or anything like that. Think of it as being similar to a folder or a directory on a hard disk where you organize related files. So this way, it facilitates applying Azure policy and RBAC because you can apply those to a specific resource group, and it flows down only to the resources in that resource group. Another benefit is that you can actually manage identity and access management, or IAM, RBAC role assignments at the resource group level. So for instance, if there's a cloud technician that needs the ability to manage virtual machines in the resource group, they could be assigned the appropriate role to that resource group. And so they could create, manage, and delete virtual machines, for instance, in that resource group, but not anywhere else in the subscription. So it helps us pare down the management capabilities of administrators. Another benefit of resource groups is to track costs and create budgets. So if you deploy virtual machines and web apps and whatever is related to a project into a resource group for that project, you automatically have a way to track costs for that project. You can also create budgets with certain configured threshold limits above which you'll get notified when you start getting above a certain price point on a per monthly basis. Pictured on the screen, we have a screenshot of a resource group and the resources deployed into it. When you go into the properties of a resource group, on the left, if you click Overview, then on the right at the bottom, you're going to have a list of all of the resources deployed into that resource group. In this case, we've got things like a key vault and numerous storage accounts. In our next screenshot, we can also configure RBAC role assignments at the resource group level. In the properties of the resource group, on the left, you would click Access Control IAM to do this. And on the right, in our particular example, user Alex Crozier, which is an Azure AD user account, has been granted the virtual machine contributor role for this resource group, whose name is showing up on the left. It's called HQ. So Alex will have the ability to create, manage, and delete virtual machines in the HQ resource group. In our next screenshot, we have an example of assigning an Azure policy to a specific resource group. That's shown over on the right. The resource group HQ is selected, and in this case, the policy definition over on the left is called Limit VM Size to Standard A1. So we're limiting the underlying horsepower for VMs, regardless of who's working with virtual machines, in the HQ resource group. Okay, so at this point, we know the relationship between an Azure subscription and an Azure AD tenant. In that, when you sign up for a new Azure account, you get a default Azure AD tenant, but you can create additional tenants. Now, in order to create resources in your subscription, such as virtual machines and storage accounts and so on, you need a subscription. And a subscription can only be linked to one Azure AD tenant at a time. You can move it between tenants, but that's the max. However, if we flip the coin, a single Azure AD tenant can have multiple subscriptions. Now, in the case that you're a larger organization and you have multiple subscriptions, whether they're all tied to one Azure AD tenant or tied to different ones, it makes no difference. But what you can do is you can organize those subscriptions under what's called a management group. Now, the benefit of this is from a governance standpoint, you could, for instance, make policy assignments at the management group level, which would flow down to the subordinate subscriptions that have been moved into those management groups. For example, if you want to check compliance for how Azure SQL database is configured, you could do that for all subscriptions if they have that need. So therefore, if you only have a single subscription, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense then to bother creating a management group. Let's see how it's done. Here in the portal, I'm going to search for management, and then I'm going to choose management group. What I have listed in the hierarchy by default is the tenant root group. So you're going to have that with all of your Azure AD accounts. And underneath it, I've got my subscription shown. In this case, my pay-as-you-go subscription. So by default, all of your Azure subscriptions will show up under the tenant root group. Now, if you have a lot of subscriptions, you might want to store them under different management groups for resource governance purposes like I was mentioning. So let's create a management group. I'm going to click the Create button up at the top, and I'm going to call this MG1 for management group 1. That's the group ID. Then the display name will be MG1. And then I'll click Submit. And before you know it, our management group MG1 is created. Now, there's nothing underneath MG1. If I click on it, I can view the details for it, but there are no subscriptions organized into this management group. Now, I'm going to close that out with the X in the upper right. You can also create a hierarchy of management groups within management groups. So for example, let's create another management group. This one I'll call East. And I'll click submit. And after a moment, the East management group is shown here. Now for East, if I go over to the far right and click the little menu button, I could choose to move this to somewhere else within the hierarchy. I could create a child management group here or add a subscription there. Or of course I could delete the management group. So let's go and move our MG1 management group under East. So I'm going to choose move. It's going to go under East and I'll choose save. Okay, so now we're manipulating the hierarchy of management groups. The next thing I want to do is move my pay-as-you-go subscription under MG1. So for my pay-as-you-go subscription, I'll click on the menu button to the far right for it, and I'll choose move. So I'm going to move it in the hierarchy into MG1. So I'm going to select that and choose save. Okay, so now under our tenant root group, if I drill down under East and MG1, there's the pay-as-you-go subscription. Now the way that this would be used, for instance, is when we're working with Azure policy assignments. So I'll search for policy in the search bar at the top, and I'll click on policy. When I go to my policy assignments, if I were to assign a policy or an initiative, which is just a collection of related policies, either way, I have to set the scope of where I want that policy assignment to apply. The default is the subscription here, but I can click on the menu button on the far right, and this is where I could select a management group, whether it's the tenant root group, East, or in this case, MG1. Now, of course, in our case, we only have one subscription under MG1, so why even bother doing all this? It's just an example, but if we had multiple subscriptions under MG1, they would then have whatever policy we configure in this assignment applied to them. That saves you from having to apply the same policy to multiple subscriptions separately. And therein lies the primary purpose of working with management groups. Now, that's how you work with it here in the portal, in the GUI, but if you really wanted to, you could also, for example, view management groups using the CLI. So let's say I open up the Cloud Shell here in the Azure portal, and I'll maximize it, and I'll clear the screen with CLS, so I can issue the AZ account management-group list command. So that will show me my three management groups, the default tenant root group, East, and MG1. I'm going to clear the screen because we can also use the up arrow key on that command and then add at the end of it, -- query, space, open close square bracket, dot display name with a capital N. That way, all we're viewing are the names of the management groups. As you might imagine, we could also add subscriptions to management groups, create and also delete management groups if we so chose using the AZ account management-group syntax. Now, if you're more of a PowerShell person, you might also run get-command and maybe asterisk wildcard symbol, management group, and another asterisk wildcard symbol. You get a list of commandlets that have management group in their name. And one of the first ones I see, for instance, is get-az management group. Get-az management group. And again, this is returning information related to the tenant root group, the East, and the MG1 root groups. In the Azure cloud, resource groups are used to organize related resources. So for example, you might create a resource group called Project A, and when you deploy any resources like virtual machines, storage accounts, web apps, whatever the case might be, you could choose to deploy it into that resource group. The idea is that we can then track costs for all the resources by going to the resource group. We can delete the resource group and all of its resources in one action. In the portal, we can navigate to the resource group and see only the resources deployed into it. So it doesn't have to be based on project. You might create a resource group for each department or business unit or region, or you might have a resource group for testing versus production. There are many ways that it can be utilized. So let's go ahead then here in the portal and let's create and manage a resource group. First thing we should do is view existing resource groups. If I open up the navigator in the left-hand side of the portal, I can click on resource groups to get a list of just those. For example, if I click on a resource group I've already got here called RG1, when I'm looking at the overview blade for that resource group on the right and down below, we have a list of the resources that were deployed into that resource group. Or they might even have been deployed in other resource groups, but they might have been moved here. Either way, they currently are associated with this resource group. And if I scroll down just a little bit on the left under cost management, I can click cost analysis. What this means is I'm going to be able to analyze costs specifically only for resources deployed into this resource group. So if you want to track costs by region or for testing or production or by department, by anything, you can do it if you've organized resources in resource groups. You can also create budgets for this particular resource group. A budget is used so you set a threshold, for example, on costs, so that you get notified when you begin to approach that configured threshold for cost. Let's not forget, of course, in the upper left, I can click on Access Control IM, and I can actually add role assignments on this resource group. For example, if you need to allow a technician to create and manage virtual machines only in this resource group, you could go ahead and add a role assignment for that here at the resource group level, and it would only apply to VMs here, as opposed to setting a role assignment at the subscription level, for example. So let's go ahead and create a new resource group. I'm going to start by going home here in the portal, and I'll click Create a Resource, and I'll search for Resource Group, and I'll click on Resource Group. If you get prompted to accept the certificate on the site, just click OK. Okay, so I'm going to click Create. So the resource group is part of a subscription. You get to choose that subscription from the list. I've only got one. I'm going to go ahead and call this resource group Project B, and I'll leave the region or the location to East US. I'll click Next. You can add tag information to a resource group like you can to any Azure resource. So I'm going to select Project, which is a pre-existing tag with a pre-existing value of ABC. Otherwise, I could type in new values. You can add up to 50 of these name and value pairs. I'm okay with this, so I'm going to click Next, Review and Create. Then I'll click the Create button. It's going to be very quick. So in the upper right of my bell notification icon, if I click on it, it states that the resource group was created. Why don't we open up our left-hand navigator here in the portal? Once again, why don't we view the resource groups view? So now notice I have a Project B resource group, and if I click on it, and I'm in the overview blade, there are no resources in this resource group by default. Now, still being in the overview blade, I could click the Create button up at the top and choose to create something like a virtual machine where the resource group is already populated, in this case with Project B. Of course, if I were to go home and create a resource from scratch in this manner, the resource group is not populated. I have the option to create a new one, or I can choose an existing one from the list, like Project B. And you'll notice that if you're working at the command line, whether you're talking about the CLI or PowerShell, or even if you're making API programmatic calls, when you deal with resources, you'll often have to specify a resource group type of value, such as when you're creating, let's say, a storage account using a command line tool. So let's quickly fill out the blanks here to deploy this virtual machine into the Project B resource group. It's going to be just a standard Windows Server 2019 VM. I'll call it WinServe 2019-2. I'm just going to scroll down. Basically, I'm going to accept the defaults other than specifying a username and a password. This username and password have nothing to do with Azure AD. This is a username and a password within the Windows operating system for this virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and just click Review and Create, and then I'll click the Create button. So we're deploying a virtual machine and the resources that go along with that to this resource group. It won't take long before the deployment is complete. So what I like to do then is go to my resource groups on the left, and I'm going to click Project B, and in the overview blade, notice now over on the right, we now have stuff. We've got resources that were deployed here. We've got a virtual network. We've got the virtual machine object and its related public IP address. A network security group to control traffic into and out of network interfaces, such as the network interface below. You can also associate the network security group with the subnet to control traffic into and out of it. And then we've got the virtual machine disk object. Now these are active links, which means if I wanted to, I could click directly, let's say, on the virtual machine to open up its properties. If I click tags over on the left, notice that it does not inherit tags set at the resource group. So for example, up in the breadcrumb trail on the upper left, if I go back to Project B and look at tags, remember when we created it, we set it to Project ABC? Well, you're not going to find that when you go into the properties of any of the resources that are deployed into that resource group. You look at their tags. And the same thing is true if you add tags now, after resources are already in the resource group. So I'm back to the Project B resource group. If I go to tags on the left, there's Project ABC. Let's say we add cost, center, YHZ. So I'm adding a second tag name and value pair, and I'll click apply. Okay, so that's been added here. If we go back to the overview blade and take a look at any of the resources in this resource group and check out their tags, they do not inherit tags from the resource group, and that's important to know. Of course, if you go to views like the All Resources view here in the portal, among some of the other columns of information, you'll also have a column for the resource group that the resource was deployed into. And of course, you could sort by that, or you could filter the list from here. Currently, the resource group is set to all resource groups. Well, I could just scroll down to my list and select the appropriate resource group. It'll have in parentheses a number of resources in it. So let's just apply this for Project B. So now we're only looking at Project B type of resources. So that's the overall purpose then of working with resource groups in Azure. In this demonstration, I'm going to use the CLI to create a resource group. Now, by this point, we know what resource groups are used for. They're used to organize related cloud resources into a manageable unit. That manageable unit being the resource group. You can track costs at that level. You can view policies that might have been assigned to that resource group. You can see RBAC assignments that might have been applied only to that resource group for management purposes. And it also just gives you a way to filter out all of your resources in the Azure cloud by some meaningful strain of similarity, like having a resource group for a project or for a department or a business unit or a region. Now, here in the portal, I can expand my menu on the left and I can view the resource groups view. However, we're here to do this at the CLI. So here in the portal, I'll click the Cloud Shell icon up at the top to the right of the search bar, and that'll just go ahead and maximize that window. Now, the text is a little small, so I can just click the config or the cog icon. And from here, I can go to text size and increase it to large. Okay, so let's get started with this. I'll type CLS. First thing I'm going to do is run AZ group create -- name. I'm going to call this project C. Now, I need to also specify the region or location, and I can do that with -- location. In this case, I want it to be placed in the East US region, so I'll just go ahead and press enter to create that. Okay, so the provisioning state returns a value of succeeded. So, for example, if we minimize the Cloud Shell and go back here in the portal and refresh our resource group list, you may have to click refresh and wait a minute or two, but there's the Project C resource group. And of course, if I click on it in the overview blade over on the far right and down, we have no resources yet that are deployed to that resource group. So let's go back into Cloud Shell. So I'll clear the screen, and I'll run AZ group list, and I'll press enter. So it's listing each and every resource group along with the properties for each and every resource group. That's a little overwhelming to look at if you just want a simple list. So I'm going to clear the screen, and I'll use the up arrow key to go back to AZ group list. But what I want to add to the end of it, we'll start with this -- output, and we'll tell it that we want the output organized in a table. That's a little easier to digest. So we have the name of the resource group in the leftmost column, followed by the location or region, and then the status, the provisioning status, which of course is that it succeeded. And notice, of course, our resource group project C is showing in the list. So now we have a resource group to which we can deploy resources. So as an example, why don't we deploy a storage account to it here through the CLI? So AZ storage account create -- resource -- group. Now you can use -- and the full parameter name, or a single dash and the shorthand parameter such as G for resource group. Either way, you get the same result. I want this deployed into a resource group called Project C. -- name will be store count YHC789, and -- location for the storage account, let's say is East US. And finally, -- the SKU will be standard _ LRS. Locally redundant storage is what LRS stands for. Let's press enter to create that storage account. All right, so I'll clear the screen and I'll run AZ storage account list -- output table just so it's easier to look at. Well, because of my screen resolution, it wraps around. However, what I am seeing is the name of the storage account, the region, in this case East US, and of course the resource group. And in our case, that was to Project C. Now, what I could also do, because opening to a table didn't work out so well here, is I could run AZ storage account list -- query space open close square bracket dot name. Just ask for the name property. But what if I also want to see the resource group? How do I specify more than one property on the command line when I'm using -- query to filter out other stuff I don't want to see? Let's take a look at that. Clear screen with CLS. The first thing to bear in mind is to determine what the property names are. If you run AZ storage account list, even though it gives you all of the output, in this case, that's what I want. We have a property called resource group, and it's case sensitive here. So the word group is an initial capital, so capital G, but everything else is lowercase. That's going to be important. If I use my up arrow key to bring up previous commands, I can get back to our storage account list command where we'll be querying and asking only for the name property. Now, what I'm going to do to specify more than one property to be returned is after -- query space open close square bracket dot, where we currently have name, right before name, I'm going to put in a single quote and an open square bracket. This is the notation you need to use when you want to specify multiple attributes that should be returned. What you do is separate each attribute with a comma. So name, comma, resource group, capital G, of course. That's all I want, so I'm just going to put in my closing square bracket and then my single quote. So I'm going to press enter, and notice that what it will do is return not only the name of each storage account, but directly underneath it, it will display the name of the resource group into which the storage account was deployed. So for our storage account, store account YHC789, it returns Project C. The next thing I'm curious about is how do I get a list of resources within that resource group here at the CLI? So I'm going to clear the screen, and to figure that out, I'm going to try this. AZ resource list -G for resource group, or I could put -- resource -group, same thing. The name of the resource group I want to list this for is Project C. When I press enter, though, as usual, it returns all of the details for each resource in the Project C resource group. I don't want that. I just want the name property. Okay, no problem. CLS for clear screen, up arrow key to bring up that previous command, and we'll just add -- query space, open close, square bracket dot name. And it returns back store account YHC79. It's showing me the resources deployed in the Project C resource group. In this demonstration, I'm going to create a resource group using PowerShell. Resource groups allow us to organize related resources into some cohesive unit, and that's the resource group, in the Azure environment. It's also part of the Azure hierarchy. So at the top of the hierarchy, you've got management groups, which can be used to organize multiple subscriptions. Then you've got subscriptions in the Azure hierarchy, then resource groups, and then you have resources that are deployed into the resource group. Now, the hierarchy is important because we can assign permissions or Azure policies to resource groups and only affect resources in those resource groups. You can also track costs by resource groups. Here in the portal, I can open up the resource groups view over here on the left to get a list of existing resource groups. I can click on any existing resource group, and in the overview blade over on the far right, I get a list of any resources deployed into it. On the left, I can go to Access Control IAM to view or set role assignments for this resource group. We can click Policies on the left, get a list of applied policies if there are any for this particular specific resource group. If I click that, we can go down under Cost Management and view the costs related just to this one and only resource group. So many compelling reasons to work with them. So what I'll do here in the portal is I'll launch the Cloud Shell. I could have downloaded and installed PowerShell module for Azure on my on-premises computer, but I'm going to opt to do it here directly through Cloud Shell instead. First thing I'm going to do is do a bit of discovery. What are the names of the commandlets related to working with resource groups? I can figure that out by running things like git-command and then using wildcards like asterisk symbols. And let's say I'm guessing that the name of the commandlet would probably have the term resource group in it. So I'll put a wildcard asterisk character at the end, press enter. Sure enough, we have all kinds of commandlets with resource group in their name. I'm not really interested in the ones that have Azure spelled out, instead just the ones that have AZ. They're the newer versions of the commandlets. Okay, so I can pare this down a little bit further. Let's clear the screen. Let's use the up arrow key to bring up that command. If I'm going to change the text here to AZ resource group. Now this is a nice streamlined list. So we can run, for example, get-AZ resource group, get a list of resource groups, or get deployments in the group. Resource groups track all of the deployments for resources that were placed in that resource group. We could use new-AZ resource group to create a new resource group, or remove one, or delete it with remove-AZ resource group. Okay, so this is better. So I'm going to clear the screen. I can also run get-help. And let's say I'm curious about what the syntax would be like specifically for parameters and their values. If I were to use new-AZ resource group, I'll add -detail at the end in case I get some syntax examples. And it looks like we do have a couple of syntax examples down here at the bottom, 3 of them to be specific, with the brief description and an example of the syntax. Of course, if I scroll back up to the top of the output for that commandlet's help page, then I get the description along with a list, an alphabetical list that is of the parameters and their values. So I can learn a lot about how to work with that commandlet, in this case, create a resource group. Okay, so let's get to it then. New-AZ resource group -name. I'm going to create one called project D, and I'll use -location to specify that I want this created in the East US region. Okay, and it happens very quickly. The provisioning state is returned here as succeeded. All right, well, naturally, let's run get-AZ resource group. So each resource group is returned, so the resource group name along with the location and the provisioning state and any potential tags and the resource ID. We're interested, of course, in project D resource group. And if I use the up arrow key to go back to our get-AZ resource group commandlet, we can pipe the result of that command on the left to something on the right. So for example, let's pipe the result of that to select and tell it we want to select the resource group name property. And it returns only the resource group names, and we're interested primarily in this case in project D. Now you might wonder, how do you know that the property is called resource group name and not name? Well, you can experiment, or you just get experience using these, or you can definitively find out with get-AZ resource group, and you can pipe that to get-member-type property. And this will show you only the properties that result from running get-AZ resource group, one of which is, surprise, resource group name. Now we can get specific and tell it we want to run get-AZ resource group against a specific resource group, so -name project D. And it returns information only about that one and only resource group. And of course, let's say we wanted to deploy a storage account or some kind of resource in that resource group. So new-AZ storage account, in this case, -resource group name. In this case, I want to deploy that storage account in project D resource group. -name, I want this to be called store account IHC 7132. -location for the storage account, let's say East US again. And the SKU name is going to be standard _ locally redundant. So LRS, I'll put that in quotes and I'll press enter. So we can deploy stuff into the resource group, whether we do it through the GUI or as we're doing here in PowerShell, the CLI doesn't matter. But that's the purpose, isn't it, of a resource group, is to deploy resources into it to facilitate management on many different levels. Okay, so the storage account has been deployed to the project D resource group, and we can verify this also by going back into the GUI part of the portal. And let's say in our left-hand navigator, we click storage accounts. So there's the store account YHZ 7132 named account, and if we take a look at the resource group column, it is now reflecting project D. Of course, if I click on the link for the project D resource group in the overview blade, it shows the resources in it, and it's showing that storage account. At this point, we have experience creating resource groups in a variety of different ways. The next thing to get into is moving resources between resource groups. Let's get started here by perhaps taking a look at a virtual machine. So in my left-hand navigator in the portal, I'll go to the virtual machines view. I've got a virtual machine named WinServe 2019-2. Now, of course, there are other resources associated with it, perhaps a public IP address resource, definitely a network interface resource, an OS disk resource. We would see more of that information by going to all resources, where I can filter by name. I'll just type in WinServe 2019-2, and indeed, we've got the virtual machine, public IP address, network security group, network interface, and disk. Now I'm going to click on the virtual machine to open up its properties. And one of the things I'm going to do here is set an RBAC role assignment directly at this resource, because when you move the resource to a different resource group, RBAC role assignments on that specific resource is lost. It doesn't move along with the resource being moved to a new resource group. So for example, on the left here, I'll go to access control IAM, and I'm going to add a role assignment. Let's say it's just the reader role. I'll click next, and I'll click select members. Let's say I add user Cody Blackwell, so he will have that role. And I'll just click review and assign, and then review and assign. So in my notification bell icon, the role assignment was added successfully. I can also verify this by going to role assignments, and maybe I'll search for user Cody. So Cody Blackwell has reader, and that was granted at this resource, this virtual machine. In the overview blade for this virtual machine, we have a number of buttons at the top, such as the ability to connect to it for remote management, starting, stopping, restarting the VM, capturing an image, deleting. But there's nothing here about moving it to a different resource group. Now that's interesting, because if I were to go, let's say, to the storage accounts view and open up a storage account, in its overview blade, there's a button at the top for moving it, either moving it to another subscription or to another resource group. Interesting. But that's okay, because what I can do is go back, let's say, to our virtual machines view. Now, the virtual machine in question here is WinServe 2019-2. It's currently in the project B resource group. If I click on the link for the resource group, so if I go to the resource group's properties, and I'm in the overview blade, over on the right, if I put a check mark by the server, by the resource in this case I want to move, I can then open up the move menu at the top here. So I can select to move this to another resource group, which is ultimately what I'm going to choose, move to another subscription, or move to another region, another geographical location. I'm going to choose move to another resource group. So the source resource group here is project B in the pay-as-you-go subscription. The target resource group here I'm going to select as project D. Now, just before we do that, let's duplicate this web page. And the reason is because I want to take a look at the resource ID for that virtual machine. The reason I want to look at that is because the resource ID will change when you move the resource to a new resource group. So anything that depended on the old resource ID, whether it's a script, whether it's a custom item added to a dashboard, you're going to have to change those references to the new resource ID, which you'll be able to see after it's been moved to the new resource group. Here are the properties of my virtual machine. I go down and click on properties, literally over on the left. And then if I scroll down, the resource ID is shown here. So what I'm going to do is copy that and paste it into a WordPad document. And then we'll do the same thing after the virtual machine was moved to the new resource group. And we'll see if the resource ID, in fact, has changed. Okay, so I pasted that old resource ID into WordPad. Well, it's not old right now, it's current, but it will become old. Okay, so I'm going to close this browser window back to where we were. I'm going to click next And what it's doing is it's checking whether the resource can be moved. In this case, it's just one, the virtual machine. None of the related resources like the public IP address, the disk, the network security group, none of that stuff will be moved automatically with this. It's only what I select. And all I selected was the virtual machine. So we'll give it a moment here to check the validity of my request. Okay, so now under validation status, it says succeeded. So let's continue with moving the virtual machine to the new target resource group. So to do that, I'll click the next button down at the bottom, turn on the check mark to say that I understand that anything that looks at the old resource ID will not work until I update it, like a script or whatever the case might be. No problem. I'll turn on the check mark and I'll click move. Okay, so after a few minutes, if I check my notification bell icon in the upper right, it says moving resources complete. Okay, let's check that out. If I go back to the virtual machines view, WinServe 2019-2 is now showing as being in the Project D resource group. So we moved it from Project B to Project D. Let's open up that virtual machine and let's go down and click on properties on the left because we want to compare the new resource ID with the old ones. I'm going to copy that resource ID and I'll paste it here into WordPad. Now, at first glance, you might wonder, well, what's changed? I mean, the subscription is the same and so on, but what's different, of course, is the resource group makes up part of the resource ID, the name of the resource group, Project B versus Project D. So if you had scripts that might have referenced the old resource ID prior to us performing the move, those scripts will fail now because we won't be able to find that resource any longer. Also, here in the properties of our moved virtual machine, if we go to Access Control IM and if we go to Role Assignments, and if we filter it, let's say for Cody, it says no user assignments exist because it gets removed, as we know, when we move resources from one resource group to another. When you deploy a resource in the Azure cloud, whether it's a virtual machine, a web app, a logic app, a storage account, whatever it is, not only do you have to tie it to a subscription, but you also have to deploy it to a resource group, whether it's an existing one, or you're going to create a new one as you're deploying the resource. So for example, here in the portal, if I click create a resource, and it could be anything I'm creating, let's say a virtual machine, one of the first things you have to deal with is an existing resource group or a new one. Okay, so let's click the X to close out of there. What I want to do here is open up my left-hand navigator and go to the resource groups view. Because one interesting aspect of a resource group is that all deployments to it are remembered. Let me show you what I mean. Let's open up an existing resource group. So that puts us in the overview blade for it. And over on the right, of course, if we scroll down, we'll get a listing of the resources that currently exist within that resource group. And of course, they're live links. So if I click on one, it takes me into its properties, like a storage account that I've clicked on here. Now within an individual resource, of course, I can scroll down way down towards the bottom under automation. And if I choose export template, this is the ARM template that I could, for example, download and tweak to suit my needs to deploy a storage account similar to this one that I'm looking at here. Of course, you'd want to tweak things and change them a bit, such as using a unique storage account name and so on. However, that's the individual resource, not the resource group. Let's click the X to get out of that, and we're back in our resource group, RG1 in our case. So in the left-hand navigator for the resource group, I can scroll down, and under settings, I can click deployments. This is really interesting. This is a historical listing, so the oldest stuff is at the bottom by default. This is a historical listing of deployments to this resource group, whether they succeeded or whether they failed. So for example, a storage account was created on a specific date and time, it's date and time stamped, and I can click directly on a link for a deployment. This is normally what we see in the portal when we deploy something. We get the your deployment is complete type of message. Over on the left, if I click inputs, I have the data that served as inputs into this deployment, like the location to deploy a storage account, the name of the storage account, the type of the storage account, the access tier default setting, and many other properties as seen as we scroll down further. Now some deployments will have outputs, others will not. This does not have any outputs. And of course, I can click template over on the left to get the ARM template, the Azure Resource Manager template for this particular item. And of course, you could download it, you could tweak it or change it, you could even deploy it. That's the same type of thing we saw here in the overview where you can redeploy. When you click redeploy at the top, as we scroll down here, it's got the settings for what we were deploying, which in this case was a storage account way back when, as evidenced by the date and timestamp for this deployment into the resource group. And we could change any of these values. We could choose edit template. This is an ARM template. We can make changes at that level. We could edit the parameters that are fed into the template, specifically the parameter values. And we could, of course, continue and review and create the resources based on this past deployment. For example, if those resources are no longer in this resource group, perhaps they've been moved to another one, maybe they've been deleted and you want to recreate them. So very interesting to know. If I click the X in the upper right, and I'll do that again, not for my browser, but for the pages I'm looking at here in the portal, we also have failures, as I've mentioned, for deployments that didn't succeed. And I can click error details to see what happened. I can click raw error at the top to get further details about what the issue was. Now bear in mind that when you do look at one of these specific deployments, if you go to template and download it, which I will do here, it downloads a zip file that you could then use to create future deployments. So if I were to unzip that downloaded file, so I'm just going to go ahead and unzip it, and I'll choose extract here. Okay, so we've got a parameters JSON file. I can open that up, in this case, using anything local. I'm going to use WordPad. So here are the parameters and values that can be used along with the template itself. Its name is template.json. Same thing, I can double click to open it up in whatever software on my machine is associated with JSON files. And then we are exposed to the contents of that template. So we can use that in the future. So we might normally make some tweaks here, changing things like names of resources that will be created. And then back here in the portal, if I were to go home and create a resource, if I search for the word template, I could create a template deployment. So if I could create on that, I could then click build your own template in the editor where I could load a file. So I'm going to go ahead and click load file to upload the template I just downloaded. Now, depending on the template, will determine what I see here in terms of information it needs to know. So all of these items may or may not appear depending on the type of resource you're deploying with the template and what's been hardwired into the template versus what's required as a parameter value. So knowing that you can go back and view the deployment details for past resources in a resource group can be very useful. In this demonstration, I'm going to be deleting a resource group using the portal. Now, when you delete a resource group, you will also be deleting all of the resources deployed into that resource group. So you need to be very careful about doing this. It's kind of like deleting a parent folder on a disk and then also selecting to delete all the supported items in that hierarchy within that folder. Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. It could be a good thing if you set up a resource group, for instance, for testing purposes. You deploy a bunch of resources into that resource group, and when you're finished, you can easily remove all of those resources because testing is complete. So let's start off here in the portal by opening up the left-hand navigator and then going to our resource groups view. In this case, I'm going to select a resource group called Project D. And in the overview blade, if I follow through over on the right and go down, I get a list of all of the resources deployed into that resource group. Likewise, I can also go to the All Resources view and filter on the resource group. So from here, if I just want to see everything in the Project B resource group, I could select just that. I could click Apply, and the list changes to only show me resources deployed into that specific resource group. So let's go back to resource groups. I'm going to click Project D. So it's got a storage account and a virtual machine in it. So when I delete the Project D resource group, they're going to be deleted also. Let's see if that's true. I'm going to click the Delete Resource Group button up the top. It wants me to type in the name of the resource group. No problem. I'll type it in, Project D. Then down below it says there are 2 resources in this resource group that will be deleted. And of course, it's listed the storage account and the virtual machine. I'm going to go ahead and choose delete. So in our notification area, it's in the midst of deleting our resource group, project D. That also means it's going to delete the listed storage account, store account YHC7132, and my virtual machine, WinServe 2019-2. After a moment, once it's completed, I can check the status here in the notification icon in the upper right, and it says it deleted the resource group, project D. But did it also delete our virtual machine? Let's go to the virtual machines view. There's only one here, and it's not the one that used to be in the project D resource group. Likewise, if I were to check my storage accounts, the storage account we had previously that was deployed in the project D resource group no longer exists. As a matter of fact, if I tried to filter my all resources group on project D, well, of course, project D is no longer there, so it's not even selectable. So if I start Cloud Shell here, and then if I maximize it, we can also delete resources using command line tools like PowerShell. For example, if I type get-command *az resource group *, one of the commandlets that gets returned is remove-az resource group. And if I get help on that commandlet, and I'll ask for detail, then it gives me the help page for it, including a number of examples. Example 2 is what I'm interested in. Get-az resource group -name, and you give the name of the resource group, and you pipe the result of that to remove-az resource group with the -force command line parameter. And as explained below, the force parameter simply means it won't ask you, are you sure you want to do this? Let's go ahead and give that a whirl. First of all, get-az resource group. And I'll pipe that to select. I only want to see the resource group name. Okay, so I want to delete the project_A resource group. To do that, I'll run get-az resource group -name, project_A, and I'll pipe that to remove-az resource group with the -force parameter. And we can also use the Azure CLI to delete resource groups. Let's begin here by running az group list. And then I'll add -- query space open close square bracket .name. Okay, I want to delete the project B resource group. So to do that, I'm going to run az group delete -- name project B, and I'll press enter. Now I didn't specify any command line parameters to force this or to bypass the confirmation, so it asks, are you sure you want to perform this operation? Of course, knowing it will delete resources within the resource group. So when you're issuing these commands with a powerful account, you need to make sure you know what you're doing and that you're sure you want to delete the resource group. So I am in this case, I'll type the letter Y for yes, and I'll press enter. So we have numerous ways then by which we can delete a resource group. The key is that when you delete a resource group, you are also deleting all of the resources within it. So in this course, we've examined how to manage management groups and resource groups. We did this by exploring how management groups and resource groups are used in an Azure environment. We created an Azure management group using the portal, using the CLI, and finally PowerShell. We also moved Azure resources between resource groups, viewed resource group deployments, and deleted resource groups. In our next course, we're going to move on to explore how to manage storage account blobs using various tools.